all a David Blaine level of deception. Today's story is so incredible you may not even think it was possible, but let me assure you that it is not only possible, but it happened, and it didn't happen as long ago as you probably think. So let's gallop into the infamous tale of Sylvester Carmouche and the Delta Downs Fog. The Jockey. We don't have a ton of the backstory of Sylvester J. Carmouche Jr. Sources aren't great about his early life, but we do know he was born April 4th, 1959, and he was a native of Louisiana, specifically a suburb of the city of Lafayette. And we know that from a very early age, he loved being around horses. So it seemed almost natural that he would somehow end up involved with horses as a career. And as it turned out, he wasn't just involved with horses, he was a pretty accomplished jockey, racing at tracks all over Louisiana. He built a reputation for being an above-average rider, an expert at getting the most from horses come race day, and above all, he was a winner. He won more than 700 races over the course of his career, including at some notable tracks like the Fairgrounds in New Orleans and Louisiana Downs near Shreveport. He earned himself a living doing what he loved, which is pretty successful in my book. But for some reason, on January 11th, 1990, he did something odd. Something super ballsy, and something that ultimately would end up defining his horse racing career. The race. Horse racing, as many of you are no doubt aware, doesn't exactly have the cleanest of reputations. Cheating is, let's be serious, at least somewhat common, and the reputations of those around racetracks, and indeed the sport as a whole, are not always exactly the most pristine. But most cheating in horse racing falls into a fairly typical set of categories. There's your classic race fixing, which has been around since there were people betting on horse races. There's also doping in the horses, which has become more and more scientific and complex over time. You even hear about some pretty wild circumstances, like switching horses before races, or jockeys fighting each other from their horses during the race. But not many people would have the guts to try what Sylvester Carmouche did that fateful day in Vinton, Louisiana. The scene of the crime is Delta Downs. It opened in September 1973, and it's evolved considerably over the years. Today, the track has been expanded to include a hotel and casino, which is owned and operated by Boyd Gaming. But back in 1990, it was your typical racetrack. Carmouche would be riding a 5-year-old horse named Landing Officer in a 1-mile race. In 1-mile races at Delta Downs at the time, the horses start out in a straightaway, pass the grandstand, circle the track once, and then finish with a second pass of the grandstand. Trust me, those logistics will be important in just a minute or so. The experts didn't expect much from Landing Officer or Carmouche, as evidenced by the fact that the horse started as a 23-1 long shot. And the task of winning this race was made even more difficult by the weather, though it wasn't just more difficult for the jockeys trying to race around the track. Even the spectators and race officials were struggling, as a thick fog had rolled in from the nearby Gulf of Mexico. The fog was so dense that they couldn't even see the track from the grandstands or even the sidelines. When the race began, the horses took off into the foggy abyss. At least that was what folks assumed, because they couldn't see a darn thing. Everyone was effectively blind to what was happening on the track. Instead, they listened as the loud pounding of the horses into the track gave the only signal as to what was happening. As the race wore on, Landing Officer and Carmouche were the first to emerge from the fog, sporting a huge lead on the rest of the field. They ended up crossing the finish line just under track record time with a 24-length victory on a muddy track in dense fog. And immediately the letters BS came to everyone's mind. There were immediate signs that all was not right. Not only did the horse and jockey nearly set a track record in appalling weather conditions, but the horse didn't even look tired after finishing. Also, a couple of the jockeys who had believed they were in the lead reported seeing what they thought was a loose horse on the track ahead as they came around to the home stretch, though this turned out to be Carmouche riding Landing Officer. Race officials were so suspicious that the prize purse for the race, as well as all bets, were immediately held for payout pending review. And in the end, everyone determined that Carmouche had done something absolutely bananas. When the gun went off and the race started, instead of taking off, he just parked his horse right there on the track. Like, he didn't move at all. He just kind of hung out there, twiddling his thumbs, biding his time. Then he waited to hear the rest of the field coming up behind him before turning on the gas and finishing the race in style. The incredibly thick fog hid this deception from the race officials, the stewards, the spectators, and even some of the jockeys who were further back in the pack. This was about as ballsy as it gets. In a sport with such a questionable reputation already, built so scandalously over decades and decades of fraud, it's hard to believe that cheating could get any more brazen. But on this day in Louisiana, even the crooks were in shock. Sylvester Carmouche, along with his accomplice Mother Nature, had tried to swindle the swindlers, and he almost pulled it off. But he didn't pull it off, and now he was going to pay the price. The aftermath. Race officials hit Carmouche with the old disqualification for the race, and yeah, I guess that goes without saying. But taking it one step further, they actually turned over a dump truck of evidence, including what video they had of the race, to the Louisiana State Police. They started their investigation right away, and a little over a week after the infamous race, Carmouche was charged with felony theft by fraud. It took more than a year for the legal case to make its way through the system, but in the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to 30 days in prison. Interestingly, his 30-day sentence was reduced to 10 days after he had paid a $250 fine. And for those wondering, he was being paid $50 to be the jockey, and he would have won another $90 for winning, though I'm guessing money would have been changing hands in some way elsewhere. But this was just the court case. Remember, this man made his career racing horses. How would he be impacted there? Well, the answer came pretty quickly, as he was suspended for 10 years from being a professional jockey by the State Horse Racing Commission. Interestingly, the ban ended up being lifted after 8.5 years, and he did attempt a comeback starting in 1998. But as you can imagine, he could never fully escape that remarkable and scandalous day in 1990. Carmouche eventually retired, and much later in life, he was pretty honest about what happened. Just a few years ago, at the age of 62, he was interviewed by the New York Times, and he said, quote, "I did it. I was wrong. I did my time," end quote. Carmouche